the Prince of Porcelain, and an investigation in the State House of Representatives. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Brian Mackey, State House reporter for NPR Illinois. Welcome, Brian.
Good to be with you, Bruce.
And also Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science from University of Illinois, Springfield. Welcome, Kent.
Good to be here.
Great. Well, we've got an investigation that is going to consume perhaps, or at least touch on, the State House of Representatives. This is going to be led by Maggie Hickey, a former federal prosecutor, once Inspector General for Governor Bruce Rushton, and she's been called in by Speaker Mike Madigan to examine this culture of sexism, of sexual harassment, of things, inappropriate things that are going on or are said to have been going on in the State House and state government, for that matter, for quite some time. What are we to make of this, I guess? Is this going to be a truly independent investigation? And how much of a risk might Madigan be taking, if at all, in doing this? Does he have a choice in doing this? What do we think?
Well, I mean, in my experience, he doesn't do something like this, invite some outside heat into his organization unless he feels his hand is being forced. Mm-hmm. So does he have a choice? I would say that the evidence suggests that he did not, if he's taking this action. We should add that he made this selection, he says, in consultation with a number of state legislators representing a variety of groups, white, black, Latino, Asian, gay, straight in there, who helped pick Maggie Hickey. She has an extensive track record. She's a former U.S. attorney. She's an attorney in private practice now, but she was also the executive inspector general under Governor Bruce Rushton. So she has some bipartisan credibility. And in fact, Governor Rushton was seen, I guess it was in between on-air segments at a radio show he was on in Chicago, where they keep it going on the Facebook feed, where he was actually sort of speaking positively about this move, although a backhanded compliment, you might say. Like, I don't know why she's getting involved with those people, but she's
with those people.
She's I mean, this is my paraphrase.
Fair enough.
But will it be a real investigation? Time will tell with what comes of that.
Well, what are her marching orders here? I mean, can she do whatever she wants to or with whomever she wants, or are there going to be parameters, or do we know yet?
Well, the scope, as it was described, is very broad. We're talking about the office, the operations underneath Speaker Madigan, which is going to include a large clerical, process paper kind of staff. We've got legislative analysts, budget analysts. There are professional people that analyze bills. We have, we've got the State Democratic Party, which is another entity, and so we don't really know exactly, how much of that, the various things that the speaker is involved with in terms of organizations, what we're going to get into, and then there's a sense in which, both in terms of some of the allegations that were made, and then in the way that people have talked about this, we're somewhat conflating two things. Mm-hmm. One of them is sexual harassment, but there is also this larger, cultural kind of issue about how power is being exercised. So it wasn't just about, let's say, Speaker Madigan's former chief of staff. It wasn't just about specific things that he'd done that got into the Me Too movement part of that, but also more generally about how power was being exercised. And similarly, the complaint from the one female state representative about retaliation in terms of gets into how you're exercising power in a general sense that really doesn't have anything specifically to do with kind of Me Too sexual harassment kinds of issues.
Could we be reaching a day where women are going to start running the House here in Illinois? And if so, that might not be a bad thing.
I mean, it's certainly possible. I think we saw in the Senate, Republicans have had the first female leader of a caucus, although she left after sort of attempting to resolve the budget impasse, and that fell apart. But I mean, some of the names that people have discussed in the past have been women who would be potential successors to Speaker Madigan, should he ever decide to leave the House.
Because there has been speculation this might be the thing that pushes him over the top.
I mean, there has been speculation about that. The Me Too movement is certainly a bigger sort of force than he's ever had to deal with before. It's something that's much bigger than just Illinois politics.
Sure.
It's not something that can be controlled through legislation and influence.
It's cultural, it's societal.
It's a societal thing, right.
And it's also not just the House Democratic Caucus.
Well, that's
We have to be clear about this.
Yeah.
There are three other caucuses, of which we have, are organizations that employ both clerical kinds of people, professional people. All three of those other organizations are heavily involved with running political campaigns, which can be a pretty rough and tumble process. And so I wouldn't, it would not surprise me if other things got put on the plate, and this got things that the Speaker can control.
Well, I mean, that's an excellent. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Brian.
I was just to add on to what Kent was saying. I think that's a great point in what you said earlier, Kent, about not conflating or being sure that we recognize this is not just sexual harassment. There's also a culture of just bullying and just a high pressure work environment.
Sure.
And I think you see really the House Democrats have a reputation. Like I know and have a little friendly chit chat with members of other caucuses. Just you see them on the floor, but House Democrats, they do not talk to you. They don't. I mean, they keep their head down. They do their job. It is a very sort of. It has a reputation for being almost like a monastic culture there in some sense. But with a sort of punishing top-down structure, and you don't get out of line. And you can imagine how when this was more of a boys' club and the legislators were more mostly men, you could use some strong-arm tactics that in the light of 2018 and #MeToo just don't seem as appropriate anymore as they might have once just been brushed off.
Sure.
You can't use them in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, when Lou Lang, for example, was forced out of leadership after being accused, one of the things that his accuser had complained about was that he yelled at me. He'd call up and yell, and some folks were apparently said, well, that's what Lou Lang does. When he wants something done, he yells at you. If you don't, he's not a touchy-feely, fuzzy-wuzzy sort of guy. He's a legislator and needs to, when he wants to get from point A to point B and you're not helping him, he makes his feelings known. Is that inappropriate in some way? I mean, how can you run a caucus? How can you get stuff accomplished if you don't have folks afraid of you at some point?
I don't know that. I mean, the Senate Democrats have taken a little bit of a different approach. They seem to be more freewheeling. Everybody gets their bills heard. It's not nearly as top-down an organization. That has problems. Sometimes bills come up and members, maybe aren't on the floor. Their switch gets voted, and then they end up having to explain that to the voters a year from that. I mean, things can get out of hand with that approach as well. But you don't necessarily. You can be politically successful and not necessarily have that quite as
abrasive,
rough and abrasive structure, but or can you? Right? That's going to be the real test of time here.
And also, what are your where are you crossing a line where government gets involved in terms of enforcing laws? Obviously you can't create a hostile work environment that involves sexual harassment, let alone sexual assault. But there are lots of people who work for successful bosses who are not very nice people, and they are both men and women,
right.
and that's part of a work environment, and how much of that should government be getting involved with in terms of micromanaging people's feelings within the workplace. And so the sexual harassment, sexual assault part of this is very serious. That's a cultural problem. But again, we're mixing up or combining a number of different things. And having worked for a partisan legislative staff, that's quite a different environment than working for a public university, for instance.
Sure. Well, I mean, and when Madigan announced this, he said this would cover, the 200 employees who work for the Speaker's office, and so I obtained a list of those 200 employees, and it would seem to include folks that aren't necessarily just working for the Democrats. So, for example, there's, I can't remember how many janitors, for example. Now, I don't know, I would hope that they don't have Republican janitors and Democratic janitors. I pull that example out of the air. I mean, how much could this be an oil slick that spreads over to the other side of the aisle? I mean, how Madigan has started this investigation. Are the Republicans just going to be bystanders, or is there a chance they could get involved?
Well, it's certainly a possibility. I think that if Ms. Hickey were to uncover some questionable conduct that involves somebody on the other side of the aisle, I suspect that the Democrats, if she didn't, would find a way to make that known publicly. So it certainly seems that if that behavior is there to be found, it's just waiting to be discovered. I think that there's probably still a lot of people who are watching over their shoulder in Springfield based on things they've done before fall of 2017 that maybe would be considered differently afterwards.
And with the new legislative inspector general process, and we assume a new legislative inspector general, there certainly have been indications that there are people who have stories to tell that have been waiting for a structure that they have more confidence in. And so I don't think we've seen the end of this by any stretch of the imagination.
Do we think that Hickey has the chops and the reputation where folks will feel comfortable coming forward who have stories to tell? I mean, how can these folks be assured that, hey, this isn't going to come back on me?
Well, first, the tremendous amount of publicity that is out there is obviously a factor, and so everybody, there's just a lot of scrutiny, and you're going to be very careful about and want to be very thorough and very complete. This is a woman who's been, head of the executive inspector general's office, overseeing a large staff that's been involved with these kinds of issues in a wide range of things. We're not talking about just things that might be inappropriate, behavior, but also, ethical claims in terms of how someone is performing their job. And so, I think you don't want to prejudge this one way or another. But I think you certainly have created you have a situation where you're likely to get, I think, a pretty good examination.
Okay. Do we have a sense yet whether this is going to be, because we have been told there will be a report at the end of this investigation and it will be made public. Do we get do we know yet whether it's just going to be one big report at the end, or is there going to be interim stuff? And elections are coming up. I mean, what are the odds we might hear something prior to Election Day?
I just don't know the answer to that question. One would expect that if there was a way to bury things, there would be an inclination to do that. On the other hand, this has proven to be a very hot topic this year, and so if there's stuff to come out, there will also be people pushing to do that too, regardless of the consequences.
And you can get referrals. I mean, things that come out of this investigation could be referred to the legislative inspector general, which has a process of how you do investigations and do findings.
And we might not know that if that happens either.
Yeah, and so you could get essentially a consultant's management report about how to better run the House of Representatives. Right. And so there's a wide range of
I'm sure Mr. Madigan will be happy to see that. With regard, because, transparency would seem to be important here. For example, former Representative Duncan, his name was mentioned in the latest round of, he'd done something inappropriate. Sherry Garrett, I think, had come forward, and the initial reaction to that was, we dealt with that, but we didn't have the Duncan name attached to it. How important is naming names at this point, if at all?
That depends on who you ask. Some people who have, some of the women who have been at the forefront of trying to change the culture, say they're trying to change the culture in Springfield, say, we don't want to get into name. We could go out to the microphones now and name a bunch of names of our colleagues who are dogs or, were inappropriate behaviors, whatever phrase you want to use.
Or other sorts of animals.
Yeah, exactly. But they say we don't want this to be about, well, we fixed those people and now we can move on. We want this to be about the culture. So some people are pushing to not make this about individual names. They're pushing to make this about changing the overall culture and making sure that this is viewed as unacceptable. I think, though, that what we've seen from our own industry, at least you and me in the media, is that when names are attached, this gets more attention.
Yep.
And so as a way of pushing this forward and keeping public pressure on the issue, adding names to it has worked to raise awareness of it.
Oh yeah, you get a Lou Lang out there and people are really paying attention. There had been stuff that had come out without names attached. I'm trying to think, her name is escaping me now. She's a former journalist who put out a
Carrie
book.
Lester.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really horrible things, but with no names attached. And I'm not sure that Lester's, putting out that book had as much impact as, collectively, a lot of bad things that happened in that book, as much as, geez, it's Lou Lang, or it's Tim Mapes.
Chief of Staff,
or it's Tim Mapes. Well, let's shift gears here for a second here, another hot topic, that being child separations at the border of Mexico, not Indiana or something like that. There have been attempts now to, at least by J.B. Pritzker, to tie the governor to Bruce Rauner, the latest round of commercials being, Bruce Rauner won't say that he will withdraw National Guard troops from enforcing the border, and that somehow makes him complicit in the separation of kids from their families who have tried migrating from Mexico. Is that going to be a successful move by J.B. Pritzker? There have been attempts to tie him to Trump periodically. Is this something worth doing even?
In a way, I would say that tying Governor Rauner to President Trump is one of the main strategies of the Pritzker campaign. And I think that no matter what, in one sense, no matter what the governor says about the president, he could take out a picture of him and light it on fire, and I'm sure the Pritzker campaign would find some way to say, well, he didn't chop it into 20 pieces first before he lit it on fire.
To global warming.
Right. There would be something wrong with it. It would never be enough. And so, but on the other hand, Governor Rauner, remember, barely won his primary against a more conservative challenger, and he needs to keep those people who are still enthusiastic, that still significant number of Republicans who are enthusiastic about the president's approach to shaking things up in Washington. They want, he wants to sort of tie himself to that and say, well, I'm still shaking things up in Springfield. So it's sort of a balancing act that the governor is walking with that. But we did see him this week say, at first he sort of denounced the child separations without really saying that he wanted the president to change his policy. Then the next day he sort of was a little more clear in his statement. But will it ever be enough for the Pritzker campaign? Well, of course not, but that's why he's paying a large staff of communications professionals to try and make hay out of this.
But the polls have showed, the Gallup poll came out this week and showed that Trump has a 45% approval rating. He's as popular now as Obama was at this point during his first term. There's another poll that had come out, it may have even been the Gallup one, that says both parties are equally energized coming into to these midterms. Now that's on a national level. Illinois is obviously a fairly blue state. Are changing attitudes about Trump, does that have much of a chance of affecting us here?
I just don't think that Trump or, border separations are going to be the critical thing that we're talking about in November. I think that it is about the governor's record as a governor versus the governor's attempt to say that J.B. Pritzker is a terrible, nasty guy. He's not gubernatorial. Sure, there have been some, we haven't done as well as we wanted, but do you really want to take that risk? And Pritzker is sitting on the other side saying, 4 years of disaster, and he wants a second chance. Why wouldn't you go with the fresh face, the new person? And so I think the border separations get to congressional districts, and similarly with Trump, Trump is not very popular in Illinois overall, but it's about congressional districts, and so there are congressional districts that the Democrats would like to, in one case pick up, in another case, save a congressman in more southern Illinois, where attacking Trump would be a very bad strategy.
Well, I mean, let's pick a race then that we should be familiar with, hopefully familiar with. We'll get a lot more familiar with Londrigan versus Rodney Davis. I mean, that's could at least in theory might be something of a competitive district. Could this have an effect on that one?
I mean, you would think it was supposed to be a competitive district, and it was the first time that Congressman Davis ran in 2012. I think he won by a very, I don't remember the number, but a few hundred votes or something like that. It was a very small margin. But since then, he's won pretty handily, but the Democrats keep trying. And, one imagines that in a year, if this blue wave materializes, as some of the prognosticators have said it might, although we're still very early and who knows what events could change, but if it materializes, that seems like a district that could would plausibly be one of the ones to flip. And certainly Democrats have made it a target repeatedly since he's gotten into office, but he's managed to hold on, and he works hard to sort of point out the bipartisan things he does. And I covered an extraordinary news conference he did with after a meeting with Senator Durbin last summer. And it's not often you see two congressmen from opposing parties doing a joint news conference back in the home state. But I mean, I think that was the only time I've ever seen it. But I mean, he works hard to sort of burnish that image.
Yeah, a lot of water under the bridge between now and election time. I mean, we know that health care is going to be something that Lonergan is going to push. And Davis has been very strong in terms of the repeal and replace sort of Obamacare. Immigration, I mean, if we're talking about border security, then that's going to play to Davis's advantage. If we're talking about immigration in terms of separating, little children and toddlers from their mothers, that's going to play to Lonergan's advantage. And so it is about how does this play out, and then how do they frame it?
Speaking of blue wave and moving a bit away from Trump for a second, the latest news from our friend Mark Maxwell at WCIA Television has reported that Dylan Clark, the Democratic challenger to Avery Bourne, has falsely claimed to be a volunteer firefighter. It seems to be quite a bit of evidence that he did falsely claim to be a volunteer firefighter. He also used to work for Bruce Rauner. What's going on? I mean, do the Democrats vet these candidates, or was that? How does something like that happen?
I'm gonna pass. I have not followed the stories closely, to be honest with you.
I mean, yes, you always want to do opposition research on your candidates.
They didn't know he'd volunteered for Rauner?
Well, and no, that's not necessarily, depending on when it happened, it's not necessarily fatal. Embellishing your resume, that's a much bigger problem.
Sure.
Because the critical, when you're trying to frame a race, if you can say, it doesn't matter what positions this person holds, they're not trustworthy. They'll lie to you. They won't, and so you've got to have this, there's kind of a threshold of credibility. You drive your opponent below that threshold, then it really doesn't matter what great ideas they have for solving the problems of Illinois, because they're just they're not qualified. And so this is potentially a major issue, depending on how much money you've got and how you can frame it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we should all remember Ronald Reagan was a bunch of Democrats, so it's possible for folks to change minds and change ideologies, and everything's fine. So, we also have kind of the early going, the Prince of Porcelain television ad that's come out. This is J.B. Pritzker being attacked by the governor for removing fixtures, toilets, from his mansion in Chicago in order to get a tax break.
A neighboring mansion, right?
A neighboring mansion.
Bought the house next door with the idea. I mean, who hasn't bought the house next door with the idea of expanding your house to encompass that one, or tear it down and expand your property? I mean,
me?
Well, okay. So you get my point. Apparently, this has been something that I think we certainly have not heard the last of it. It certainly does go to the point that Mr. Pritzker is not just like us. He is extraordinarily wealthy. He's wealthy even by Governor Rauner's standards. But, of course, Governor Rauner has, reporters have done stories about his own exotic investments and the private equity company that he used to have his name on the door of, probably still does have his name on the door of, or his initial anyway. Job losses related to that when they would take over and liquidate and lay off people. I mean, there are people who do people who are that rich do things that seem very crazy to the rest of us. And it's going to make good campaign fodder.
I got to say, I kind of, just on the basis of the presentation, yeah, it is kind of, how many toilets? I mean, I lost count at like 6, 7, 8, something like that.
Yeah.
The idea, and maybe we should say, the idea was to make the house uninhabitable for property tax purposes, which lower the tax rate on it.
And
he's never heard of an outhouse.
Yeah, and the Pritzker people are going to talk about all of Rauner's houses and whether he's taken appropriate, property tax breaks and exemptions in relation to how he spent his money. And so, ultimately, if it boils down to kind of, to a billion and almost a billionaire and a multi-billionaire and throwing down against each other in terms of who's got the best tax lawyers, that's the conversation that normal people just don't have and can't relate to.
Well, we might see some ads from Sam McCann at some point. Well, maybe not, but yeah, it's an excellent point. I mean, billionaires eating their young. I mean, it's unusual, at least in the history of Illinois politics.
Yeah, it does do the narrative. Pritzker is not qualified. He's not honest. He's not whatever. And that's
he's a Madigan clone.
And that's Rauner cannot run on his record, and Pritzker is going to talk about over and over again what a failure Rauner is, and so he has to, Rauner's best hope is to make Pritzker unacceptable, unqualified, and so this is going to be an unbelievably negative campaign. That's not a fresh thought on my part.
Well, and with that, we have run out of time. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.